Hey everybody, we are going to get started here in just a couple minutes. Right now people are joining the webinar and we're waiting for them to get into the system here. So just hang tight and we'll start in a couple minutes. If you are having any difficulties getting into the webinar, please type that directly into the chat box and we'll try to help you out. Just another minute or two here. We're going to try to start promptly right at 9 o'clock. So just hang tight. We'll be right with you. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Vonamy. I am the Deputy Director for the DuPage County Stormwater Management Department, and we are here today for the second part of our webinar series involving green infrastructure for MS4 Communities, where we will feature multiple speakers covering topics related to the maintenance of green infrastructure practices. This is a free webinar, and 1.5 PDHs, professional development hours, will be available. We have several of these workshops throughout the year. The Illinois Environmental Protection Agency requires this training under the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program. We are encouraging governmental staff, including stormwater, public works, and transportation staff, as well as any contractors out there to attend or view this webinar. Again, 1.5 PDHs will be available for your participation. If you have other staff that could not attend this morning, this webinar is being recorded and the presentations will be made available for viewing at their convenience. We will email the link with this information shortly following the program. Okay, before we begin, just a couple thank yous. First of all, thank you to Mary Mitros. She is our Stormwater Communications Supervisor. She helped organize the webinar and she's behind the scenes running the show today. I'd also like to thank Baxter and Woodman for helping line up our speakers for this morning. And once again, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Now for just a quick public service announcement. The DuPage County Health Department is requesting that everyone remember the 3 W's in order to stay safe during these times. And those are, number 1, wear a mask in public, wash your hands frequently, and what's the other one? Watch your distance. Sorry, watch your distance, stay at least 6 feet apart. Okay, thanks for that. Just a couple other quick notes here. I hope that everyone has a very healthy, safe, and happy holiday season this year. The holidays can be a very stressful time of year for many people. I plan to try to reduce that stress level by reading more. As a matter of fact, I plan to make that one of my New Year's resolutions this year. I think there are a lot of mental, psychological, and stress-reducing benefits to reading. So I plan to start by turning on the subtitles while binge watching my favorite movies and shows on Netflix, Hulu, Apple TV, HBO, and Showtime. That should be a lot of reading, lots and lots of reading. And if you're like me and you fail at your resolutions within a week or two, don't fret or worry about that too much because the Chinese New Year starts in the middle of February and we can try again at that time. Okay, That sounds like a great plan. I feel better about myself, and what I really feel good about are the three speakers and presentations that we have to share with you this morning. We have Susan Rowley from NCAP, Shane Carpani from Green Blue Urban, and Carrie Samansky from Contech Engineered Solutions. They will be covering topics related to green infrastructure practices, including bioswales, tree boxes, and other best management practices. Before I turn things over to them, though, I do want to remind you about our chat feature. Everyone is muted, and so if you do have questions or comments during the presentations, please type them directly into the chat box, and we will relay those to the speakers at the end of their presentations, and we'll get to as many of those as time will allow. All right, so with that, we're going to turn things over to Susan Rowley. Susan is the Assistant Vice President and Ecological Consulting Director for NCAP. Susan designs naturalized stormwater management plans, wetland mitigation plans, native landscaping projects, and assists private and public land development professionals in obtaining federal, state, and local permits relating to wetlands, natural resource management, and stormwater ordinances. Susan completed her Bachelor's of Sciences degree from Illinois State University with an emphasis on environmental studies. She is currently a professional wetland scientist and certified arborist, and today she is going to tell us all she knows about bioswales. So, Mary, please turn things over to Susan and make sure that she's not muted anymore.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And can you see that as well?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for attending today's webinar. Also, thank you to DuPage County and Baxter and Woodman for hosting and having us today. Again, my name is Susan Rowley. I work at NCAP Incorporated, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics of naturalized bioswales. Quick overview for today. I'm going to get into just a brief overview of traditional landscaping. We'll hop into naturalized landscapes and the overview of native plants and the benefits that they provide. We'll talk a little bit about conceptual planning and design, hydrology and stormwater. What are your project goals? Some soil medium and rock versus rock, native plant selection. Then we'll talk a little bit about construction, maintenance, initial maintenance and long-term maintenance, and then monitoring of the projects to ensure functionality. So why is our society so inclined to like traditional landscaping? Well, some of the positives of it is that, it looks pretty, it is homogeneous and simple, has a nice look to it, and it's dependable and reliable, and people tend to like, what they know. Some of the negatives, though, I would stress are that it's resource and labor intensive. They tend to have a high fertilizer and pesticide usage. Homeowners alone apply about 67 million pounds of fertilizer and pesticides per year on their lawns, which does account for anywhere from 3 to 10 times more per acre than a farmer does. So that's a lot of pollution getting into our systems. Also, there's quite a bit of air pollution that gets emitted from lawn mowing. So about 1 hour of lawn mowing equals about 20 miles driven in your car. And per year basis, there's about 580 million gallons of gas used by lawnmowers. And that's mostly because traditional turf grass areas need to be mowed once, even maybe twice a week, as opposed to native systems. Also, the water usage is very high. So if you wanted to water your lawn and get about 1 inch of water on your lawn, it equates to about half a gallon per square foot. So on every 10 by 10 foot area, you're going to use about 62 gallons of water, which is quite a bit of water. Also, in the long term, traditional landscaping is going to be more costly. Again, depending on the size and scope of your project, it can be anywhere from $400 an acre up to $6,500 an acre. Again, if you're paying people to come once a week to treat with fertilizer or pesticides, and once a week to mow, that just adds up to a lot more cost. So when we take a look at the native plants, what exactly are we talking about? We're talking about plants that are native to this eco region that we live in. In other words, plants that have either lived here or have adapted to living here over thousands of years, as opposed to plants that maybe were brought in from Europe or Asia for another purpose. So I like showing this slide. I'm sorry, it's a little hard to read, but the numbers on the left side are all in foot. You can see that on the very left-hand side, way over here, is turf grass. It's about 2 to 3 inches above ground and maybe 2 to 3 inches below ground of the root structure. This isn't really going to do anything beneficial for the soil. It's not going to help stabilize the ground at all, and it's not going to provide any biodiversity for your site. When you look at the native plants, which is the rest of the slide, you can see that the height above ground varies anywhere from 1 to 2 feet up to 7 or 8 feet tall. However, what I think is more impressive is the below ground root structures that this slide shows, which can range anywhere from 4 feet down to 15 feet, depending on the plant species. These deep root structures allow for the survival of plants during drought periods, which, believe it or not, we do get a lot of droughts in the summer here in the Chicago region and all throughout the Great Plains and Midwest. So that's going to allow the plants to drop water from a deeper water source during those drought periods and let them survive more so than the turf grass would. It's also going to provide superior soil stabilization over the turf grass. I just like to show this. I think it's a cool visual to kind of see what might be happening below ground that not everybody can see when you're just looking at the plants. So what are the benefits? Well, there's an extensive array of benefits from naturalized bioswales and other BMPs. The first being stormwater infiltration and capture. These systems can help reduce the runoff volume and also the runoff rate that's coming from a developed site. And some counties do allow for stormwater credits in bioswales and other BMPs as well. If you're going to get some of that capture, you might be able to reduce the size of other BMPs that are on your site. Naturalized systems are also going to provide filtration and treatment. So carbon sequestration is just one of those. The main one that we see is cleaning up of pollution and things like oil and grit and salt that are coming in from our roadways and our parking lots. That's going to get treated when it goes into these naturalized systems, again, through those deep root systems. This is also going to improve downstream water resources. So typically, these are just the first step in maybe a treatment of stormwater prior to it having to outlet eventually to probably a stream, or it may infiltrate into the ground. But either way, it's going to help treat the water before it gets released into those natural resources. Two great benefits that I see for wildlife habitat is goose reduction and also mosquito reduction, which I don't have on here, but geese definitely do not like tall grass. They instinctually think that predators are going to be living there, and they can be, the coyotes and other things that can harm them. So they tend to stay in our turf grass. They love our turf grass. They don't go into those systems. So if you have more native plants on your property, you're going to get a reduction in geese. And then for mosquito reduction, all of the wildlife that's going to be coming into these systems, so the birds, ground animals, amphibians, things like that, they're actually going to help reduce the mosquito population by helping to keep them in control, keep them in check. There's also been some studies that show that 8 times more bird species of regional concern utilize naturalized areas, 4 times more butterflies, and 3 times more butterfly species utilize these areas as well. Another benefit is that they provide soil stabilization and erosion control. So there's going to be less turbidity in the water, less sediment entering into those systems, and then eventually less water or sediment leaving the system as well. They're lower maintenance in general and lower maintenance costs than turf grass. They range anywhere, again, depending on your site, $300 to $1,200 per acre. And that's because they're going to be less resource intensive. You're not going to have fertilizers, really no fertilizers necessary, or pesticide usage on naturalized landscapes. You don't have to mow them every week, and you don't have to typically water them at all. So that's just going to reduce your costs overall. I also think they're aesthetically pleasing and diverse. So we'll get into a little bit of conceptual planning and design. When you're looking at hydrology and stormwater, siting is going to be key specifically whether you're doing maybe a new site or versus a retrofit. If you're going to be doing more of a retrofit, like what is shown here, you want to make sure that the siting of the bioswale is going to be into a low-lying depressional area, and also where the natural water flow paths are going to come from. So here you can see all the water is coming from the east. It's going to be treated through the bioswale, and then outlet to the west. And so you want to make sure you place it in the right area. Also, a term that gets utilized a lot is called treatment trains. The regulatory agencies like to use that term because it's meant for providing some kind of a treatment flow of the stormwater prior to it outletting into a natural resource. So anything that you can provide in additional benefits like rain gardens or other stormwater BMPs are just going to add to that treatment. For site engineering, you might have to get some engineers involved in your design depending on the project. Your storm sewers, again, if it's going to be new storm sewers or existing storm sewers, you might have to tie into. That'll have to be reviewed. Review of the topography and the soils. What kind of soils are we dealing with? You might have to do some drainage or runoff calculations to determine the watershed, the amount of water that's coming to your site, to make sure that the sizing of the bioswale is to the right capacity to hold the amount of water that's coming there. And also you might need to do infiltration testing. We've done that on other projects to make sure that what soils we have on site are the right soils, whether it might be sandy or clay, is going to also dictate potentially what your design is going to look like. So it's also important to note and figure out what your project goals are prior to the planning or during the planning and design phase of the project. Is your goal to reduce nuisance flooding? Is it to improve water quality or reduce your non-point source pollution? Do you want to provide an open space amenity for the community? Is it strictly just to manage stormwater runoff? Do you want to also promote infiltration or stormwater storage? Or do you want to increase community awareness of the positive impact of these areas? Most likely your project is going to have more than one of these goals at a time, or might have all of them, but that's just important to consider when you're looking at planning your project initially. So getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty with the design, using soils versus rock. If you're looking to have higher infiltration rates, then the best soil composition you'll want is a 30 to 40% sand mixture with 30 to 40% compost and about 30% topsoil, hopefully with a low clay composition. That's because the clay is going to be more of an impermeable layer that you'll run into. You might have a goal in your project to actually have more containment or more storage in your bioswale. Then you'd be looking at using more of 100% topsoil that does have some clay in it, so you do get some of that containment that you might be needing. For the best infiltration and runoff on your project, you might want to install a rock infiltration trench into the middle of your bioswale. We would recommend using riprap size 3 to 6 inches, and then wrapping that rock with a filter fabric, and that's going to help with any sediment that might run off initially in your project before maybe the plants have established fully. It's going to catch that sediment so that it doesn't clog up the system. Also in this area, due to us having very high clay content in our subsoils, a lot of times these systems require an under drain. Those are going to be sized, again, depending on the watershed and how much water you have coming into your system and how much runoff you want leaving your system, but that's going to be pretty commonly used in our area. Might be a little bit different if you're up in Lake County where they have more sandy soils and you might not need an under drain to help that infiltration. Last on the planning design, just wanted to include a couple cross sections. So if you're looking at more of a bioswale that where you want to contain or have actual standing water in it, this the top one shows sort of 6 inches to 1 foot of standing water in the bottom with your native plants up along the slopes, versus if you're looking at more of a dry bottom, something that is going to drain out and not hold any standing water. The bottom picture shows what it might look like with a perforated under drain and a rock infiltration trench in the center, and then the plants along the sides. We're talking about selection of plant material for your project. Again, the project goals are going to dictate what you want. to install. If you're looking for more of a cleaner look, more of an instant result, maybe you have something that's going to be utilized by the public right away, and you want some additional benefits from visual appeal, then you probably want to select plugs and mulch installation initially, because you're going to get more of that instant gratification than you would with seed. If you're able to wait for the results, then obviously seed and erosion control blanket would be the way to go. And that's just what these two pictures are showing, sort of the difference of plugging versus a seed and blanket. You want to make sure you utilize native plants, obviously, that are native to this ecoregion and that are also suitable to the hydrology of your bioswale. So if you're going to have a bioswale that has more water, you want to make sure you select plants that are hydrophytic and can survive in more of an inundation period in the water, versus if it's going to dry out right away, you want to select some drier plants. Also, when looking at bioswales, typically they're more in a visual spot that the public's going to see. So you want to pick aesthetically pleasing plants, but also have a purpose. So the plants list here is just a short list that we use on some other projects for bioswales and rain gardens that are more showy. These include just forbs or flower species, but sometimes they include grasses and things like that too, to provide that different structure. Also, one thing we typically don't want to have in a bioswale system is trees or shrubs. That's because the woody root systems of those can be troublesome. If you do have a drain, under drain, or some kind of system, drainage system, they may end up blocking it at some point. So you are going to use trees or shrubs, we would recommend you planting them at the top of the slope. So when we're looking at construction, you want to ensure that you install proper silt fence around your area, and maybe even some construction fencing. That's going to ensure that your site is protected as well as any adjacent sites. Obviously, make sure you call Julie before you do any excavation or grading. And most commonly used in these areas is heavy machinery, because it's going to be the most efficient use of time and resources to get the work completed. However, we would recommend, if you're going to be using heavy machinery, trying to use machinery that has low ground pressure. That way you get less soil compaction, especially if you're wanting to infiltrate into the ground. You're going to not want to compact that soil too much. If you can find the low ground pressure equipment that is about 10 pounds per square inch, it equates to about the human foot. That's what you want to try to utilize if at all possible. And then again, depending on your project and the design elements, you may or may not need to install an underdrain or riser pipe, depending on the hydrology. And this is just a picture of one that we installed with a riser pipe, because this wasn't a project in Lake County that had very high sand content, so we didn't need an underdrain in this case. Next comes planting. If you're going to use native seed and blanket, then the native seed needs to be sown into the ground at approximately 1/4 of an inch. You can use either a specialized seeder or do it by hand and rake it into the ground. If you're going to hand broadcast the seed, we would recommend you doing it at 2 times the specified rate that's spec'd out on the plans. And that's because of the more uneven distribution that you're going to get during the hand broadcasting versus it being drilled into the ground at a specific depth and rate with a drill seeder. The proper erosion control blanket should be specified out, obviously in the design stage. However, typical blanket that's utilized in a bioswale is an S150 or a straw blanket. And that's if you're going to have no velocity or low velocity in your bioswale. If you are going to have some flows or water flowage in your system, you might need to use a heavier blanket. You might need a C150, which is a straw coconut, or an even heavier blanket that's all coconut fibers. The straw fibers of the blanket are going to break down much more quickly, which is why it doesn't hold as long of a time period. They usually break down in 2 to 4 years versus the coconut that's going to take longer to break down, maybe 4 to 6 years. Versus if you want to do plugs in your bioswale, you want to plant them in the hole suitable size to hold the diameter and depth of the plug itself with its roots without damage. And then the soil excavated from the hole should be used to backfill around the plant and lightly pack it in. Lastly, if you're going to do plugs, we'd recommend including waterfowl exclusion fencing, which is shown on the picture on the right. Typically, we use chicken wire fencing with approximately 1-inch wire mesh or comparable material that's about 2 to 3 feet in height. Depending on your soil structure and your project, you can use either wood posts or metal posts. And then finally, you'll want to hang string across the top, and that will stop any aerial entry from any waterfowl. Plugs are a good source of animal depredation and feeding, especially in the early stages. If you get any waterfowl or any animals to come in there into your system, initially they'll just pull the plug basically right out of the ground. So this will help to keep them out of your system. Also, if you're going to install plugs, you'll want to do mulch around the base of the plants, about 2 to 3 inches in depth, with a double shredded hardwood mulch or whatever mulch you prefer. So we get into the maintenance. Timing is everything on this, and it's important to really be patient when it comes to native systems. Native areas take approximately 3 to 5 years to develop into maturity. And it's going to be a lot different than the instant gratification you might get from a turf in tree and shrub sort of manicured look. So typically maintenance is conducted every 4 to 6 weeks. And this can include a wide array of things listed here. If you're going to hand weed, you want to just make sure you pull out the entire root system in your smaller sites. Otherwise, hand wicking or spot herbicide application. In Illinois, you need to be a trained certified applicator in the state to apply herbicide. So you want to just make sure that's qualified personnel doing that. You do hand cutting with hand machinery, or maybe mowing with a weed whacker or something like that on your bigger sites. You might need to remulch if you get some larger storm events. You might have to replace some of the mulch if you included mulch, or maybe have to replant as necessary. There might even be some plant removal that's needed. We had a couple of projects where some of our native plants were actually out competing our other plants that we planted, and so we wanted to remove some of that growth so that it didn't overcrowd. Prescribed burning may or may not be needed on your project. If you have a smaller site, it's probably not needed on some of the larger sites, though it can be beneficial. Again, qualified personnel who are trained in prescribed burning should do that. And then probably the biggest one is going to be garbage removal and cleanup, especially if you're on projects that are highly visible to the public. You'll want to make sure that those stay clean. They do tend to pick up some wind-blown debris and things like that from parking lots. So you'll just want to make sure that that stays clean. And then I just want to stress that invasive species management is critical to success. Invasive species are always going to try to invade natural areas. So it's just critical to continue with that. Real quick, I like to include this as just a little exercise. Normally I try to get a vote from everybody of what they think is a native plant versus non-native plant. Since we can't do that here, I'll just give you just a second. They're numbered 1 through 4. Just take a quick look and take a guess whether you think each one is a native plant or a non-native plant, and then we'll kind of talk about those. All right. So number 1 is actually a native plant. It's called winged loosestrife, and it typically lives in wetlands. Number 2 is an invasive non-native plant. It's purple loosestrife, which is in the same genus as picture number 1, the winged loosestrife. It's also a wetland plant. It was brought over here from Europe because of how pretty it was, and then it escaped from the nurseries. And it started basically taking over, and you've probably seen it if you drive by some unmanaged wetlands. It can take over an entire wetland area. It looks really nice, but it doesn't do anything for the ecosystem. There's no natural predators around here that eat it, and it's very, very aggressive, and it'll outcompete a lot of the native stuff that you want to have in your system. The best way to get rid of it is to apply an aquatic approved broadleaf herbicide to it and spray it. There's also some biological methods that have been utilized, bringing in some weevils and beetles to actually eat the plant. Again, you have to get proper permits for that, but it's a very hard plant to get rid of. All right, number 3 is also non-native invasive plant. This is crown vetch, which lives mostly in upland areas. This plant again was brought over from Europe as a soil stabilization plant. Therefore, IDA actually used it in a lot of its early mixes. You've probably seen it all over along the highways everywhere. However, they soon found out that it does nothing for soil stabilization. It has a shallow root zone, and it actually grows maybe 1 to 2 feet off the ground. So it's really doing nothing to stabilize the soil, unfortunately. And the best way to get rid of it is, again, to apply herbicide to it, since it is a perennial. And then number 4 is a native plant. This is Golden Alexander's. It's a mesic species that likes to live kind of in between wet and dry areas. And I kind of wanted to just show these specific plants to show that, not all pretty showy plants are going to be maybe seen as native, and maybe not all subdued plants are going to be the non-native ones. So it can be an array of ones that look great and look very pretty, but they are actually bad for the system. And then obviously proper plant identification is critical, because like I showed in 1 and 2, they're both a loosestrife. When they're not flowering, they tend to look very similar. So it's important to, know your plants and know what exactly you're going to be treating on your site before you treat it. So for long-term maintenance, after your initial 3 to 5 year maintenance period, you're going to enter into a long-term phase. Typically that's conducted every 8 to 12 weeks. So it's going to be lower maintenance, but it's not going to be no maintenance. And that's a common misconception, is that once your site establishes that you can just stop maintenance. Unfortunately, that's not true. Invasive species are going to try to come in no matter what and try to take over. So it's important to continue with the maintenance. You will be able to do it less often. On some of your traditional looking systems, you might have to do more maintenance, especially with the garbage removal and things like that to keep it up. But over time, you will have less maintenance on your systems. So lastly, monitoring is also key to the success of your natural areas. It's important to monitor the system for functionality. So you want to check and make sure, is there any sediment buildup or mulch buildup that's causing any blockages in your system? Make sure that's working well. Also, is your drainage system functioning? Make sure it's not too wet or too dry, and make sure that everything is working, all the pipes and everything are working properly. It's also important to monitor the vegetation. So is there any negative animal depredation that's happening? Do you need to reestablish your waterfowl fencing and fix that and make sure that you keep the animals out? And then also monitor for good wildlife usage. What is using it that's going to be beneficial to your system and help support your system. It's also important to monitor for invasive species. So take a look at your sites, and if there are native invasive species coming in, you make sure your maintenance crews are aware of that and that they can go out and appropriately treat those. You want to check obviously for any plant survivorship or mortality, if there's any replanting needed, and if there's any bare areas that you might need to reseed or replant in those areas as well. So here I just wanted to show sort of a typical dry bottom bioswale. This is in the first year of development, so it's not very showy. It is mostly grasses at this point. However, it is functioning as designed, it's stabilized, and we know over time it's going to continue to develop. So just kind of wanted to show what that might look visually. And then secondly, here's a typical first year of a wet bottom bioswale that has standing water in it year round. Again, this one looks more developed because when you're plugging in the plants in the bottom, they establish more quickly. But again, this one is doing really well. It's functioning as designed. It's all stabilized and doing really well at this point for first year. So some conclusions and takeaways. Just planning and siting is critical to success of your project. Obviously the native species are going to provide a beneficial function for your system. It's important to select appropriate species for the area and make sure that you get a project design team, engineers on board early in the process so that you can design it properly so that it functions properly. Maintenance and adaptive management is going to be key to success of the area. Making sure that you keep up with that is imperative. And then expect the unexpected, be flexible. Things happen you may not expect. So just be ready to handle anything that might come up on your project. And that's all I had.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Susan. We do have a couple quick questions that have come in. So here's the first one. Do bioswale under drains need to be cleaned out?
Typically, they shouldn't have to be. If it has been properly installed and designed, you shouldn't have a lot of runoff. I mean, I don't think that we've ever had to do that on any of our systems. So you shouldn't have to. I mean, there may be some, nuances that happen that you may have to go in there and try to clean them out, but typically they shouldn't have to be cleaned out.
Okay, great. Thank you. What is the cost difference per square yard for plugs versus blanket?
Square yard difference in cost. So erosion control blanket, again, it depends on the type you're using. With your typical sort of S150 straw blanket, an install price is going to be, I would say, right around $1.50 per square yard. For plugs, it's usually a per plug price, and for us, they're generally anywhere from $4 to $5 per plug installed. Now, that doesn't really help by square yardage, but hopefully that gives some idea of how many plugs you might need on your site.
Sure, thank you. A couple other ones. When would you want a wet bioswale versus a dry bioswale? Is it just for aesthetic purposes?
No, it might be, again, if you're trying to get more capture, I would say, of your stormwater versus less infiltration. So the dry bottom, typically you're going to get more infiltration, higher infiltration rates versus a wet bottom that you might get more capture in those. And some of it is, yes, just aesthetic. If you're looking for a something that has emergent bottom and wet bottom and trying to maybe get different wildlife to your site, that would be another thing to look at.
Okay, great. And we got one final question here. I've seen maintenance with equipment creating rutting and flow path damage. Any advice to prevent that?
The best thing I'd say is if you can use low ground pressure equipment, again, that 10 PSI is ideal so that you don't get rutting. Or if it's not possible to do that, if it's possible to use hand equipment, that would also be beneficial. I know it's more time consuming and you may not have a budget for that. You could also use timber mats if you needed to get into an area that was really wet and you had to use machinery in there to get at it. You could put down some timber mats to access the site as well.
All right, great. Susan, thank you very much. Great job. Appreciate you being here. But right now, we're going to go on to our next speaker, and that is Shane Carpani. Shane is a consultant at Green Blue Urban, where he works with landscape architects, civil engineers, and other industry professionals to increase urban tree planting success and improve stormwater management sustainability on projects across the Midwest. He helps to create more sustainable urban landscapes where people want to live, work, and visit. And today, Shane will focus his discussion on tree boxes. So Shane, take it away.
Thank you very much, Chris. I just want to confirm that you can see my screen here. Is that right?
Yes,
Street
sir. We can
Trees
see it.
101.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for joining here. I'm excited to be here and speak about street trees. This is something that is very important to me and all of us here at Green Blue Urban. And we want to talk about the key to successful urban tree planting. So what are the factors and considerations that we need to have to ensure that we're having trees that are establishing and reaching maturity even in the harshest of urban settings? And then in turn, we're going to talk about how we can use those kinds of engineered tree pits and healthy street trees to help us manage stormwater. So starting with this statistic of the average lifespan of a street tree, this is between 5 to 10 years. So this isn't necessarily taking into effect a park tree or a tree in a softscape setting. This is a tree in a hardscape, sidewalk, urban plaza kind of application, similar to what we're seeing on the screen here. And when the average lifespan is between 5 to 10 years, that's really troubling because the benefits that we want to see from trees, many are very well known, like oxygen creation and carbon mitigation and shade provision and a basic standpoint, to other things that are not so well known, like urban heat island reduction, noise abatement, wind deflection, traffic calming, health improvement, many different benefits that trees provide in addition to the stormwater management side, of course. The thing about these benefits is that they happen as the tree is mature. The more mature the tree is, the more these benefits we're going to realize. And when the average average street tree is dying in 5 to 10 years, we're not seeing much of those benefits. And during those 5 to 10 years, the trees are stunted and struggling in their growth because of improper planting, similar to what we're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen here. When the reality is that if we want trees that are reaching maturity and providing benefit, not only in terms of stormwater management, but also in all these other benefits that we've been just mentioned briefly, we need to provide for a root system for that tree. Healthy trees require healthy root systems. If we want the above ground benefits that trees can provide, we need to be considering the below ground requirements of those trees during our design phase. Now imagine these a row of healthy trees along a streetscape or an urban plaza area, and imagine the kind of rooting volume that we need below ground. It's a lot easier said than done in an urban environment where there's hardscape surfaces and utilities and building foundations and all kinds of different infrastructure that competes for that space. And that's really where soil cells or an arbor system, tree boxes, if you will, comes into play. And this is what marries the needs of the tree with the needs of the built environment so that we get both of those elements coexisting together so that we can have that healthy, mature tree while ensuring the protection of our built infrastructure. So we can see this system here. It's a structurally load-bearing system that assembles below ground to provide support for a paved surface above it, while it's full of healthy, uncompacted soil that can be used for root growth and or stormwater storage. And the amount of soil that we need for any given tree depends on a couple of factors, being the species of the tree and also the mature canopy diameter of that tree. And depending on those factors, it can range from 300 cubic feet of soil requirement per tree to over 1,000 cubic feet of soil requirement per tree in order for that given tree to reach what we would call its species potential. Now, these numbers that we're looking at here, these targets that we're looking at here are based on individual tree pits. One of the most common ways of accomplishing high soil volumes in urban areas is by linking tree pits together and having like a linear fashion where those trees are sharing soil volume. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. It's very easy to work utilities into these soil systems, whether they be new utilities or existing utilities. We can see here them being worked directly into the system in varying different ways. It could be worked around a utility conduit. And for maintenance, of course, in the event that that utility did need to be accessed after the fact, you can access it in a similar fashion to which you would access for maintenance otherwise. In terms of some of the slides we can see on the screen here, an overview of that in terms of removing the lid, air spading out the soil, and accessing the utility. Or it could be below the system altogether, as we can see here. So looking at irrigation and aeration, because soil volume is only the first consideration with a healthy urban tree. In addition to soil volume, of course, we know that trees need oxygen and water. So we need to ensure that just providing that soil volume underneath the hardscape isn't enough. We need to ensure that that soil volume remains healthy long term. And a key part of that is by oxygen provision and water provision into it, and of course organic gases being allowed to leave that system so that we keep a healthy aerobic conditions within the soil, prevent anaerobic conditions from arising. So the soil cell system plays a vital role in that because of the uncompacted volume. We're bringing water and oxygen in through surface inlets or vents, if you will, similar to what we can see here, that are allowing water and oxygen to access the soil and also allowing organic gases to leave the soil so that we get that healthy gaseous exchange and prevent a buildup of organic gases inside the soil. We also, of course, want to manage tree roots because in urban areas where we have a lot of utilities and different elements, we need to ensure that the tree roots are staying within our intended rooting areas and away from paved surfaces, utilities, building foundations, whatever that particular gray infrastructure or built infrastructure might be. Now here we can see a smooth root barrier like the soil cells. These are manufactured from 100% recycled plastic, and they allow us to run these along a building foundation or utility to help protect that building foundation or utility from root intrusion. Similarly, here we have a ribbed system. You can see the addition of the vertical ribs in this application here. And this is for directing tree roots downward. So this is what we're using to protect our paved surfaces. These ribs direct the roots downward away from the paved surface and into the soil cell system so that we don't have roots colonizing immediately underneath the paved surface. And that's when we have pavement heave and sidewalk cracking and different issues that are often associated with improper urban tree planting. So we want to direct those roots down and away from that paved surface and into the soil cell system where they have plenty of adequate and healthy soil volume to exploit. We look at stabilizing a tree, and we want to ensure that we're providing that support for a newly planted tree in its establishment phase. And what we're looking at on the screen here is an alternate to that more traditional guying wires and tree staking. This is providing a couple benefits. Number one is that there is no maintenance involved in this. You don't have to go back years later and remove guying wires and tree stakes in many cases, which is not done over time. And they can end up being a detriment to the tree when they're not removed over time. They start girdling the tree trunk and etc. Now, this also provides for the free sway of the trunk of the tree, which encourages root growth, fibrous root growth out of the tree. So it helps establish that tree. It's available in different anchoring types depending on the specifics of the application. Here we can see that system working here. We also look at protecting the root ball zone or the tree pit opening from pedestrian foot compaction, and that's done through a tree grate in many instances, as we can see here. And of course, the vertical tree guards as well. It could be, this is a paving stone version of a tree grate to allow for an alternate to that more traditional metal style tree grate. The important thing to remember about tree grates and tree guards are twofold. Number one, that we need to ensure that there's adequate opening. So we never recommend less than a 16 to 24 inch opening in these, and that's to provide for the growth of the tree. And number two is the fact that these are for the establishment phase of the tree, not necessarily the life of the tree. So once the tree is established and beyond that initial establishment phase, if you will, these can be removed. They don't have to be for the life of the tree. Or it could be through a tree pit fence or a raised planter type application here instead of a grate and guard. Less important about what it is and more important that we're just considering that need of protection during the establishment phase of the tree, because those first 3 to 5 years of a newly planted tree's life are really the make it or break it point. If we can get the tree beyond those first 3 to 5 years and protect it from vandalism, whether it be intentional or unintentional pedestrian vandalism, bicycles being locked to trees are a very common cause of tree damage and premature tree mortality in urban trees. If we can help protect that tree in those first 3 to 5 years, its chances of long-term survival and maturity rise exponentially after that establishment phase of the first 3 to 5 years. So now that we've talked about how to accomplish a healthy tree, we'll take a look quickly at how to use those tree boxes or engineered tree pits to help us manage stormwater. And because we have this healthy uncompacted soil volume in the system, we can use that soil volume to attenuate stormwater. This short animation here is kind of going to show some different ways to bring the stormwater into the system, whether it be through a curb, like a curb inlet in through a catch basin, removing silt and sediment, bringing it in to the system. It could be through a linear drain, as we're seeing around the tree pit opening there. The linear drain can also be along the back of a curb in many applications. We can see stormwater entering through the arbor vent inlet that we talked about a few slides ago. It could be through a permeable surface, allowing a permeable paver surface, as we can see here, that allowing that percolation down through the permeable surface and into the soil cell system that's below, or it could be through another permeable surface like a resin bonded aggregate or decomposed granite material, as we see here. Regardless of how we bring the stormwater into the system, it's distributed throughout the soil profile for attenuation and tree root take-up, and any excess is drained out through the base layer through an under drain tied into the storm sewer and infiltrated into surrounding groundwater if possible. At that point, which it is much cleaner, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, because it's used the soil to filter out. It's doing two things. Number one, it's cleaning the soil because it's using the soil to filter out suspended solids and using that tree and to filter nitrogen and phosphorus and different elements like that. And then it's also reducing quantity. So it's improving quality as well as decreasing quantity as a result of that tree uptaking stormwater as irrigation, and therefore reducing the quantity of the stormwater that does come out. So here we can see a typical cross section for one of these high capacity bioretention applications. Here's a project in Madison showing this is the distribution pipe running through the system prior to being filled with soil. We could also use a modular rain garden application as a way of pre-treating stormwater. One of the considerations when bringing stormwater into these kinds of engineered tree pit systems is the salt tolerance. So it's a very important consideration. De-icing salt is obviously poisonous to all trees. Some trees are more resilient than other species. Nonetheless, there is no tree that is totally resilient to salt, de-icing salt. And one of the considerations that we need to make is how to manage that. So we either put practices in place to shut the system off during the winter months, which is sometimes what is used, or we integrate some kind of pre-treatment that's taking the stormwater and filtering out de-icing salts and hydrocarbons prior to it entering the tree planting pit. And a plug and play modular rain garden like this can help provide that. These modules can also be used for stormwater storage. So when they're not, when we're not planting a tree in them, they can be left void of soil and completely empty and wrapped in a membrane, whether it be a permeable membrane for infiltration or an impermeable membrane for storage, for detention. And the benefit of using this system for that application is that because of the strength of the system, it can be very close to the surface. And because of the 97% void space, we're really maximizing usable area and reducing excavation requirements. This rendering here was done for a Costco project that we worked on, where they use the two functions of the system in conjunction with each other. They take the rooftop runoff from this Costco building and bring it into the modules empty, wrapped in an impermeable membrane to store the stormwater, and then they use that stormwater to irrigate the tree plantings along the parking lot. So taking a look at maintenance quickly, there's two levels of maintenance involved in the system. Number one, of course, is the maintenance of the tree itself. So structural pruning of the tree, removal of leaf debris, etc. And then, of course, when we're bringing stormwater into the system, we need to ensure that primarily that the inlets are free and clear of debris and not clogged, and therefore stopping the functioning of the system. So depending on what inlet we're using, whether it be a curb inlet, a linear drain, permeable surface, whatever the method in which we're channeling stormwater into the system, has its associated maintenance involved. So we'll take a look at a few case studies here just to help put things into perspective. The Navy Pier in Chicago has used the soil cell system throughout the trees in the pier area. Here we can see the project shortly after completion there. And here the trees 2 years later, they're doing phenomenally well. Even in this completely urbanized, hardscape environment, these trees are thriving as though they're in a forest-like setting, all the while ensuring that there's not going to be any pavement heave and subsequent pavement failure as a result of how well these trees are doing. So even in the harshest of urban settings and hardscape plaza environments, trees can thrive as though they're in a forest-like setting when they're designed properly and considered for in that design phase. Here's another project in Welland, Tennessee. Had a resort there. You can see the some trees used in that application. The River Walk in Chicago, this is the River Theater. Our system is being used to provide for support for these trees. And this is also a green infrastructure application. The rainfall, that the runoff that lands on the staircase is channeled within the system to prevent as much runoff as possible. Here's a nice comparison case study of a project in Boston showing these trees on this street, this block were planted in 2015. We can see 1-year results and then subsequent 2-year growth results, just showing how well these trees are thriving even in this heavily urbanized downtown Boston environment. Pace University in New York City, here we can see a permeable paver surface with the roots-based system underneath it, allowing for percolation down into the system below to provide attenuation and stormwater management. RSM Plaza in Minneapolis. NIU, we can see here these plaza trees. Again, you can see how these trees are quite large and mature in spite of the completely paved environment in which they're planted, because they have this large volume of uncompacted soil underneath this plaza area. So there are a few resources here on the screen. Be happy to take any questions that might have come up, Chris.
Chris, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Shane, we do have a couple questions that came in here. What is the life expectancy of trees grown through this system compared to traditionally grown urban trees?
Okay, yeah, so the average lifespan of a traditionally grown, and I mean, when you say traditionally grown, when I say traditionally grown urban tree, I think of a 4-foot by 4-foot cutout in the sidewalk. That would be typically what the average street tree would be provided, is quite literally that. We see that square hole in the sidewalk and they dunk the tree in it. Those trees are lasting not much more than 5 years often, whereas a tree in this system, theoretically, because it's being provided with adequate soil volume and irrigation and aeration and all the elements that it needs, it would survive at the same rate that it would in a natural urban environment. That being said, so we've got trees that have been in this system for well over 20 years and they're still thriving to this day with no infrastructure, surrounding infrastructure damage after well over 20 years of growth.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's another question. I've heard of willows wreaking havoc on storm sewer pipes. Not being in the municipality field, I'm not sure how common that is or the age of the pipes that were damaged. In addition, how thick is the root block and has it been tested against different tree species?
So yes, there have been literally hundreds of tree species planted in this system over the last 28 years that doing this. Now, species considerations are always things that need to come in mind, less about the system and more about the surrounding environment. We need to ensure that we're planting the right tree in the right place. Now, the system is able to withstand the void space in the system allows tree roots to grow throughout the system. So in the event that a tree root did grow into one of the legs of the system, if that's kind of the question, what would happen is that root would break into fibrous rooting and kind of grow around the leg. There's different studies that we've done. We have several different sites where we've actually excavated up a tree that's been planted in the system after many years, and actually air spaded out the soil to research and document exactly how the roots had colonized throughout the system. Very, very interesting studies done in relation to that. And that, yes, they're available on our website even, so you'd be able to go on our website and download that.
Okay, a couple more here. Any long-term soil maintenance considerations, amendments or replacement?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the answer to that is no. We have trees that have been in the system for very long. From a stormwater perspective, we haven't been doing it as when we invented the system. We developed the systems purely for the benefits of the trees and the growth of the trees. The movement into the GI and low impact development and bioretention scene happened quite some time after we invented the system. So from a stormwater bioretention purpose, we've been doing that for about a decade or so. And no, we have not had to remove soil and amend it in any way. The soil does it, the trees do a very good job removing phosphorus and nitrogen. And of course, depending on what the inlet is itself, we're removing TSS, like suspended solids, prior to its entry into the system. So it's all to do with the filtering type and of course also the volume of stormwater that the system is going to be managing.
Okay, great, thank you. Do trees in soil cells or boxes have different maintenance requirements than trees in a more natural setting?
They do not. So you do not need to manage anything in regards to the root system itself. The only maintenance is in relation to like pruning of the tree, so structural elements of the tree itself, which would be similar to what it would be in a park-like setting. That being said, there might be some additional ones. For instance, if you had a tree in a streetscape application, there might be some additional pruning of the tree that would be required to ensure that the tree isn't brushing up against the building front. Obviously, there's different elements like that would be considerations on a street tree that wouldn't necessarily be a consideration of a tree in a park. But again, it's not in relation to the system, but more in relation to the surrounding environment.
Okay, great, thank you. How is the water metered to the trees, ensuring that the trees don't get waterlogged?
That's a great question. Yeah, so there's different ways of bringing stormwater into the system. So one thing to remember is that, and this should have been mentioned too, is that the trees are always free draining. The tree pit system is always free draining. So there is never a chance for it to fill up like a bathtub. There is an under drain in the system that is always taking that storm water from the base of the tree pit and removing it into the tied-in storm sewer or whatever the case may be. So that's a good question and definitely a consideration.
All right, hey, great job, Shane. Thank you very much. Great presentation and great job answering those questions. We are going to move on to our final speaker this morning, and that is Carrie Szymanski from Contech Engineered Solutions. Carrie is Contech's stormwater consultant for Northern Illinois and Wisconsin and has been with the company for over 4 years. She provides assistance to local engineers, municipalities, and regulators with the selection and design of post-construction best management practices. Carrie is a graduate of Purdue University with a BS, Bachelor of Sciences in Industrial Engineering. She will tell us this morning about maintaining post-construction best management practices.
All right, thank you so much. Just checking everyone can see my presentation up here.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right, well, special thanks to DuPage County and Baxter Woodman for having me. Very excited to be here to be talking to you about maintenance today. Like Chris mentioned, my name is Carrie Szymanski. I'm the stormwater consultant for Contech Engineered Solutions. If you're not familiar with Contech, Contech is a solutions provider assisting in the design, manufacturing, and installation of a variety of products you can see on the screen, focusing specifically on stormwater practices today. My job is to assist engineers, municipalities, and regulators help design these best management practices, most commonly used in the area just based around their site and local regulations. For example, if a new grocery store was being put on site, there's going to be some impervious area here from an active parking lot. That added area is going to have to be treated and stored, sometimes even both. So my job is to help design and help make sure that we're meeting all those local regulations for site. Today we're going to be focusing on two specific maintenance practices for two different practices, hydrodynamic separation, or HDS units, as you'll hear me abbreviate today, and corrugated pipe detention. Both of these are underground applications, and they're most commonly used in Illinois and DuPage County. Most of the time will be spent focusing on the HDS unit side, as these are most prevalent in the area and what we'll see in design for. But we will have a few minutes to talk about CMP detention towards the end as well. We'll spend most of the time going into the deep dive into maintenance, what's required for both inspection and maintenance, what sort of tools that you need, how and when you do it, and going through that entire process. But I wanted to take a step back first and kind of walk through the actual design of these products as well. Believe it or not, maintenance is actually a huge factor when we go through the actual design. We'll actually implement on where these units are placed on site. So starting off, what is a HDS unit? An HDS unit is water quality unit that's job is to treat incoming flow from a developed site. So like I mentioned, if you were having a new grocery store put on site, all that impervious area from the parking lot created by the parking lot and the building needs to be treated and sometimes stored as well. What the design of the unit revolves around is usually dependent on what the unit needs to treat. For example, that could be trash capture, TSS or total suspended solids removal, sediment capture, or even oil capture as well. It can also depend on where the project is located. DuPage County, for example, has a specific requirement that HDS units need to be sized for 80% TSS removal and 80% oil capture for a developed site. So the units can be based around, in this area, or designed around that specific regulation. There are plenty of HDS manufacturers on the market, Contractors being one of them, but the basic design and layout of the HDS unit is fairly similar across the board. There are three fundamentals you can see on the screen on how these units work. First and most important being swirl concentration. As water enters the unit, it's usually forced into a swirl chamber that extends the length of the flow path and catches all that sediment and debris that's entered through the storm sewer. From there, gravity will take over and will actually push all that captured sedimentation towards the bottom of the unit where it'll be stored until maintenance occurs. But most importantly, every HDS unit has some type of flow control. What this job is to make sure that all that sediment that you've captured remains in the unit until maintenance and doesn't get resuspended in another rain event. So here's just a few visuals of different types of HDS units that could be provided. You could see that there's a ton of different layouts here. Most commonly in the area, you will see them just as a standard manhole. But there are other site considerations that could affect the actual design of the actual HDS unit. For example, if we're working in a site where we have depth constraints, if there's shallow bedrock or utility concerns, you might end up with a vaulted HDS unit like this because you don't have the standard depth availability that you would with a manhole. Another option, if there are massive flows on site, for example, if we're working with a large manufacturing plant or something like that, where they're going to have a lot of runoff, you might actually see a kind of a joint system like this, where you'll have a separate bypass structure for peak flow events. However, you'll notice that regardless of the layout of the system, the three fundamentals still remain the same. You know, here's your swirl chamber for the vaulted units, and you can still see them in the manhole here. This is where all the water is going to be entering through the swirl chamber and actually push all that sedimentation down to the bottom of the unit where it's stored for maintenance. And then of course it does have some sort of flow control to make sure that everything that is stored remains in the unit until you do maintenance. Regarding maintenance, the most important question is how to get to the captured sediment and how do you get it out. When you're going out to perform maintenance on any HDS unit, it's important to know the certain layout of the actual unit that's there and whoever the manufacturer is. It's going to help you determine where that sediment's being stored and how to get it out. Like mentioned previously, maintenance is a huge consideration in design, but most importantly, it's going to come down to location. Where is this unit going to be placed? Is there going to be an issue getting maintenance equipment to that area? Will outside traffic be an issue? Is it paved or landscaped area? This could also depend on what type of cover the HDS unit has. Like I said, most HDS units in the DuPage County area are just going to be standard manhole covers, so not too much different than looking into a standard catch basin. However, if you are working with a vaulted unit or sometimes a very large unit, you'll have different types of covers such as trench covers and hatches. It's important to know this because sometimes for trench covers and hatches, you'll need additional equipment to go and inspect and maintain the unit just to get those hatches open. Okay, so now that we just kind of have a background on the design, let's dig a little deeper into the maintenance aspect. We'll cover quickly on what's required for both inspection and for maintenance before we go through the actual process on how to do it. Inspection is just as important as maintenance. Inspections for these units are generally pretty quick, but you'll need to make sure that you have everything you need and know what to expect before you go. Like I mentioned before, it is important to know what I mentioned on the previous slide. You know, where is the unit located? Is it obstructed in any way? What sort of cover does it have? It's most important to know what kind of unit is in the ground. Who's the manufacturer and what type of model is it? Every manufacturer on the market does have a standard operations and maintenance guide. These are usually provided with the drawings on the unit when the site is being installed, but they can usually be found free of charge on their website, or you can just reach out to the local contact and they'll be able to assist you. Why is this important and why do you need this? The way you figure out when an HDS unit needs to be maintained is by the sedimentation level that's accumulated in the unit itself. Each manufacturer, while the fundamentals of the unit are exactly the same, the actual layout might differ. So the actual sedimentation levels and when to maintain will be specific by manufacturer. So that OMN guide is going to help you determine when maintenance actually needs to occur. The second most important thing that you'll need is your measuring device. I listed a few common ones on the previous slide, either a station rod or a sludge judge. This is what you'll need to measure the sedimentation level inside the unit. Because one of the best features about using HDS as an underground application for water quality is that you do not need to enter the unit to inspect it or maintain. It makes both of these practices very easy, quick, and cost effective because you don't have to worry about confined space requirements as well. Okay, now let's move on to maintenance equipment. Let's assume that you're working on a site and you inspected it and maintenance needs to occur. What will you need? Well, for any standard HDS device, you will just need a vacuum truck. There are a few options that you can use here. The technology varies. The two main technologies used and they both have their place. You can likely maintain any system with either technology, but it ultimately comes down to efficiency. The most commonly used are fan units. It's kind of like a big shop vac. It's great at handling dry material, especially dry material that gets caught up in a stream of fast moving air and deposited into the tank. It is important to know that while these are less expensive to keep running, this cannot pull from a full column of water. On the other hand, you might have a positive displacement or blower units. These are not as common, but they act like a great pump and they're great at moving high liquid content, especially at longer distances. There is also the availability of using a vac trailer. These are typically small urban trucks that are used in ultra urban environments. These are great for getting into parking garages or other hard to reach areas. They're smaller and they're lighter. Usually come in between 5,000 and 15,000 pounds, compared to a standard vac truck, which is around 25,000 pounds. It's important to kind of know the differences because what truck is needed is going to be determined by what's on your site. So this is why it's important to know what sort of site information that you're dealing with. Where is the unit located and how is it going to affect the truck that you can use? You'll need to know how deep your truck can pull, from how far away can they pull. It usually comes down to efficiency versus capability. Vac trucks are most efficient in depths less than 30 feet. The shallower, the better. If you're dealing with an application that's 40 foot plus, or as you can see on the screen here, more of a landscaped area where the truck's going to have to pull from a farther distance, that maintenance is going to take a lot longer and it's going to affect the actual cost and lifespan of the maintenance cycle. Again, use your manufacturers if you have any questions. Contact specifically has certified maintenance providers that are experts on maintaining these systems and would be more than happy to help. Same goes for any other manufacturer. It's our job to help you with this sort of stuff. So if you have any concerns on site about products being maintained, or if you're unsure what sort of truck or equipment you should be using, please reach out to us. Okay, now let's get into the nitty-gritty and actually talk about how to inspect and maintain these units. Like I mentioned before, there's no need to enter the unit. Inspections are very, very quick and they're just as important as maintenance. When do you inspect? We do recommend inspecting HDS units twice a year as a standard. Most important inspections are within the first year, as you can really see the amount of sediment that occludes over a standard year of performance and because the site is still stabilizing. But probably the key point here is to keep records. If you've been inspecting a unit regularly, it will help you give a better idea and understanding and estimating when maintenance will actually be required, especially if you're responsible for inspecting and maintaining a plethora of units. Keeping logs on where each unit stands give you a better idea when you actually need to go out there and maintain. This goes back to what I mentioned previously about looking at the manufacturer's O&M log, because they actually come with inspection records that you can keep up to date for each unit that you are maintaining. So what are you looking for when you're doing inspection? You're typically looking for three things. First thing being floatables. You're going to be wanting to check if the level of floatables within the swirl chamber could potentially be expelled. This means that the level of floatables in the water level is pretty high to the top of this chamber right here, and assuming that you have a storm event could actually be expelled outside of the unit and pushed further downstream. Also, you will be looking for some type of oil. Like I mentioned, DuPage County does have an oil removal requirement. You'll be looking for an oil sheen. You can kind of see in this picture right here, the oil sheen on top of the water. This is typical within HDS units, but it's also important to note that if you are on a site where an oil spill has recently occurred, maintenance is definitely going to be required afterwards. But most importantly, you're going to be looking for the sediment accumulation in the sump. That's why your most important tool out there is going to be your measuring rod. What you'll be doing is you'll be measuring the sediment accumulation that's happened within the sump of the unit. That's why it's important for you to have the O&M guide to really know how much, at what point you need to create maintenance based on the unit and size of the unit that's in the ground. Here's an example of what this would look like. This is the O&M guide for the CDS unit that is provided by Contact in the area. For Contact specifically, we do recommend maintenance when the level of sediment has reached 75% in the capacity of the sump. What this means is that the sediment capacity in this area takes up about 75% of that sumped area. Based on the model size that we have in the ground, what you'll be doing is you'll be measuring the top of sediment to the top of this water surface area here. We have listed distances. This is your minimum distance allowable for maintenance. So if you're working in an area and the unit, let's say for example, this 4-foot unit right here, if you have a distance that's less than the specified distance here, that's when you know when maintenance is going to be occurring. Okay, now assuming that you go out and inspect a HDS unit and you know it needs to be maintained, what do you need to do? Very, very simple. Like I said, there's not a lot of tools required. The only thing you really need is a vac truck. No need to enter the unit. You'll just stick the vac hose down the center of the unit here, straight through the swirl chamber and into the sump right there. You will vac down the center of the system, removing any floatables, water, sediment, and oil that's accumulated within the sump. It is important to note that you should be spraying down the internals as you go. This is just to break down any sort of buildup that's occurred over, over the operation of the unit since the last maintenance period. If you're working on a unit that has a graded inlet from surface flow, the maintenance process is exactly the same. You will just have an extra step here of cleaning the debris away from the deflector pan, but it's the exact same practice. You just stick the hose down the center of the sump right here and clean everything out. Here's an example of one that was maintained not too long ago. You can see picture taken down, looking into the swirl chamber. You can see the water level and all the floatables that has occurred right here. No need to enter the unit. They just stuck the hose down the swirl chamber and into the sump. And then this is what it looks like completely dry afterwards. You can see the bottom of the sump clean right down there. I did add a few slides on waste disposal. Typically not too often talked about, but it is important to kind of question, where does the waste go? Solids will typically go to a landfill and liquids will pretty much usually go to a water treatment facility. This is usually dictated by local regulations. So check with DuPage County on where this waste should be going. It's usually split into two different types of facilities, whether that being a municipal or a privately owned facility. For privately owned, the landfill will usually take the solids, and treatment plants will either take liquids or a mixture of solids and liquids. The liquids are treated and released, commonly released to municipal sanitary systems under contract with the municipality. The pricing for the treatment facilities varies widely because it usually just depends on location and where these facilities are located in your area. Most commonly, they will go to municipal or public-owned facilities because frequently they have their own facilities because they're already set up due to existing needs for catch basin cleaning, street sweeping, anything like that. They can utilize these facilities to separate the loads and send the solids to the landfill and treat the liquid waste itself. And that's pretty much it. With these product lines that are made for HDS units, they're made with the ease of maintenance in mind. We want to make sure that the unit can continue to function for long periods of time without continual upkeep or being a hassle. I will say for inspection of HDS units, like I said, they're typically inspected once or twice a year. For actual maintenance to occur, it depends on the size of the unit and the site that it's treating itself. That's why it's important for you to keep inspection records because it can help you kind of guesstimate when maintenance actually needs to occur and get you on a standard maintenance schedule. I will say typically for HDS units, you're probably looking about every 2 to 3 years for maintaining it. So we have a few more minutes, so I'm going to spend that discussing corrugated metal pipe, underground detention, go through the same process, talking about design considerations, and then going through the actual inspection and maintenance process as well. Designing with maintenance considerations is just as prevalent when you're designing with CMP detention. You'll notice that location is just as important. Where the system's located, most of these are going to be located on lots or drived areas, but there are some in landscaped areas as well. When we're going through the design process, the most important location is where you're going to put these access risers. Very similar to that of an HDS unit, all inspection and maintenance is going to be done through these access risers. So location for these are incredibly important. When designing a system, you'll usually see them placed above any sort of major inlets, because that's where the sedimentation will be coming from. This is still a gravity fed system like an HDS unit. So when you have flow that's entering through the inlet right here, most of that sedimentation is going to occlude and drop to the bottom right where it's first entered the system. So that's where you're going to see most of your buildup. So you'll want to have an access riser there. You will also see some sort of access point by the outlet of the system. This is usually just because we want to make sure the outlet orifice is not clogged in any way and water is getting stuck within the detention system for longer than it has to be. For maintaining and inspecting these, good news is that everything that we discussed previously with HDS units is completely applicable here. So I hope you were listening. The same maintenance guidelines can be followed here because you're basically using the same practices and procedures. Of course, just to note, this is a focus on CMP detention, as this is what's commonly designed and used in the area. There are other underground options, such as concrete or HDPE chambers. And unfortunately, underground detention is not quite like HDS units, where the maintenance practices are generally the same across the board per manufacturer. The size of the system and material used is going to have a huge impact on your maintenance practices, and that's because it comes down to where those access risers are and where they can be placed based on design. For pipe, metal pipe, I should say, the material is extremely flexible regarding manufacturing, so we're able to have multiple access points directly into the system for ease of maintenance. So if you're working with a different material or different design, always good to check in with your manufacturer to make sure if there's any additional material or equipment that's going to be needed when you're inspecting and maintaining. As for inspection of CMP systems, typically inspected a little bit more often than that of an HDS unit. And that's typically because you'll have additional inspections during the winter months. Incredibly important, especially for an area that we're in, such as Chicago, that relies on areas that's using a lot of salting agents, whether that be de-icing salts or even sanding. You want to make sure that you do extra inspections after winter months, because there is potential for these sanding or salting agents to actually accumulate in the system. So you want to make sure that you basically pop in and see what's going on inside. Benefit about underground detention is, unlike HDS for CMP, is that you can enter directly into the system. It's very easy for you to basically pop in and just take a look what's going on, check the inlets in your outlet orifice without having to worry about confined spaces. As for inspection and what you're looking for, again, this is very much the same practice. Really, you're looking for the sedimentation buildup that's within the unit. I will say CMP, you're dealing with a much larger footprint than that of an HDS unit, so you're not going to see a lot of sedimentation that's going to be built up throughout the entirety of the system. Like I said, it's mostly going to be around that inlet area and for checking for any trash or debris that may have clogged by the discharge orifice. Assuming that there's a lot of buildup around those areas, maintenance will obviously need to occur. It's easiest to do this when the system is dry. It's going to make your job a lot easier. Go back to that previous slide here. You can see it's very easy for you to come in, bring that hose down here and clean up that sedimentation that's accumulated there. While you can access the system, go into the system, there's no need to. Back down through the access risers, you'll have a lot more footprint than you will with an HDS, so you're not going to see as much, but it's still important to keep that clean around the inlets and the outlets. We do request as well that while you're doing actual extra inspection after maintenance months, it's important to look into doing spring rinsing when salting agents are used as well. Like I said, there's a potential for that to accumulate into the system. And while the first spring flush of the system will transfer most of that salting agents and sanding out, for extended durability of your product, you'll want to make sure you're doing spring rinsing as well. If you were going to take anything away from this, is again, just reach out to your manufacturers. This is their job to help you with the longevity and the assistance, design and operations of these products. So if you have any questions on what material or equipment that you need, how often you should be doing it, anything like that, reach out to them, reach out to your local contact, go on their websites, because all of that will be on there, and they would be more than happy to assist you. But, that is all I have, and I'll open it if there's any questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Carrie. We do have a couple questions that came in. Can a Vector truck be used to remove oil? And are there any special disposal considerations for oil versus sediment and trash?
That's a good question. You can use a vac truck for oil removal. Sometimes it'll come down to your local regulations when it comes to disposing that, on whether or not that has to be sent to a separate facility or separated from the rest of the solids and liquids. But yes, you can use a vac hose to remove oil as well. If you were in a situation where we're dealing with a full-on oil spill, you might want to take a look at using a different product. But most typically for HDS units where you just have small amounts of oil and grease runoff from parking lots, yes, you can use a vac truck.
Okay, great. Thank you. One more question here. When performing maintenance in the field, when cleaning out wet collected material, we need to keep the material and its dewatering from re-entering the drainage system. Any good practices for this?
I'm sorry, you cut out for one thing. Can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. When performing maintenance in the field and when cleaning out wet collected material, we need to keep the material and its dewatering from re-entering the drainage system. Have you seen any good practices for this?
Well, I will say for most, very similar practice for CMP and HDS is you will go during a dry event when there's basically no flow entering the unit. I have seen in the past that when they're actually installing the unit, there will usually be guards over the inlet and the outlet to make sure that any construction or potential sedimentation that's accumulated during that time to escape downstream, that they'll actually cover the outlet while they're doing actual maintenance for it. But with most of that sedimentation that's going to be accumulated in the sump, there's not going to be any, I guess, availability for that sedimentation to escape that area and discharge downstream because it's locked within the swirl chamber in the sump, where you're putting the hose of the unit, hose of the vac truck and sucking it all out. You're not going to have to worry about that stuff discharging further downstream because it's all stuck within inside the unit already.
All right, great. Hey, thank you very much. Great job. Right now, we're going to turn things over to Sarah Hunn. Sarah is our director for the DuPage County Stormwater Management Department. And Sarah is going to say a few words about a wrap up and some closing remarks. So take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, Christopher. We may go a couple minutes late, but please bear with us. I'll try to be quick on this. So on behalf of Stormwater Management, as always, I want to thank everyone who attended, and also thank you for not openly booing Christopher's dad jokes every time. And of course, thank you to all of our speakers. We appreciate you taking the time to share your information and expertise with all of us to help improve water quality within our systems. Having guest speakers that are both local as well as from outside the local area gives us a well-rounded perspective on both new and existing practices. So thanks to Susan for reminding us that there is a science to species selection and that you need to think about both depth of water and water flow in an area for your selections. And then Shane's presentation made me wonder if Costco not only uses these systems, but also sells them to their members in bulk. And I think in the future, I need to work with Carrie to incorporate a shameless plug for DuPage County's shared services group, because DuPage County stormwater crews are well versed in maintaining these systems and helping local communities maintain these systems. And so we can help any of our local agencies. Another thing I want to note is that we do have a local Vector station where this material can be disposed of. And if you'd like to utilize that station, you can call our DuPage County Public Works Department. Sean Reese heads that up. And some final items for today. Last week, we gave you a sample of a short PSA that we have available on YouTube. If you look at the link as we're showing below, we've developed a series of videos and we're making them publicly available. These videos are both targeted for MS4 communities and residential best practices. You can visit the YouTube channel to view all of these videos, but first we're going to take a minute to view another one of our short PSAs.
Proper cleanup of spills reduces the chance of pollutants ending up in streams, lakes, and rivers. In the event of a spill, work to isolate, covering surrounding storm drains to prevent entry or encircling the drain with oil-absorbent booms. Utilize rags, pads, or absorbent granules, or oil dry for cleanup. Avoid using water to wash the area. Sweep up absorbed spill. Notify management about spills with significant volume. Refill the used spill kit material. And create and maintain a log of spills to discover any future operational improvements. Cleaning up spills correctly prevents water body impairment. Remember, everything that goes down storm drains flows directly to our streams and rivers.
Outstanding, and thank you very much. And these are, I'm sorry, the presentations will be available on our website, and you should be getting an email from Mary within the next couple days thanking you for being part of this.